those chains rattling? It's like Marley's Ghost. It's really just a low-flying aircraft, that's what it is. Welcome to the episode of Jay Leno's Garage. The car we're featuring today, technically, is a 1908 Benz-Mercedes. Not a Mercedes-Benz, a Benz-Mercedes. And by that I mean, this is a car that was raced at Brooklands and built in 1921. You know, the fad back in the day was you would take a big aero-engine and you'd put it in an automobile, because at the turn of the last century, aero-engines were just bigger, faster, more powerful, more reliable versions of car engines. They would have two ignition systems, two magnetos, or a magneto and a battery and coil. A lot of technology that came along much later started in airplanes. Once airplanes got into radial engines and all kinds of things like that, they lost their automotive application. And this is a classic example of that. This is a 1914 Benz 230 horsepower aero engine. This is a car we have been working on for the better part of 10 years. We'd work on it for a while, put it off in the corner for a few minutes, and then come back. The biggest problem when I got this vehicle was it ran, but just barely. See, a guy named Scarsbrick built this car in 1921 to run at Brooklands. This car was often confused with the Count Zabronsky cars, the Chitty Chitty Bang Bangs. He built 3 of those cars. The Chitty Chitty Bang Bangs were aero-engine cars. If you're wondering where the name Chitty Chitty Bang Bang comes from, it's a children's story. But the actual phrase itself was a rather rude phrase that soldiers in World War I would use. Well, you can imagine what it meant. And men would say it to each other like this and wink, wink, you know, and women would go, what are you talking about? Oh, nothing there. And then when Fleming wrote the children's book, it just became even funnier to people that, oh, the kids don't really know what Chitty Chitty Bang Bang means. But anyway, this car was thought to be one of those. And it is an exact, almost copy back in the day of one of those cars. This car ran at Brooklands in 1921. It lapped at 113 miles an hour. And it did a couple of Danish runs on some track somewhere. So it has a bit of racing history, but it is a genuine Brooklands car from the period. So that makes it kind of exciting. It is 4 valves per cylinder. 1800's about the end of the world RPM wise. It's fascinating to watch. You'll see it go in a minute here. The trick part was these were steel, and the car sat for years and years. Well, what happened was it went through a number of owners. People thought it was a Chitty Chitty Bang Bang car and then were disappointed when they found out it wasn't. The last prominent owner was Peter Helk. He was probably the foremost automotive artist of his period, just about any period really. He did all the classic magazine covers for Esquire and all those kind of magazines when they had an automotive theme to it. And he bought this car, and a man named Jim Ho, who was a Duesenberg restorer, did all the restoration of it back in the early 60s. Then it sat for a while, and what happened was the steel water jackets just rusted out. And when I got the car, it would run, but you could only run for a mile or two because the water would just leak out all over the place. So our good friend Jimmy, and our metal man here, he does beautiful work. He decided we should make these out of brass. Well, let me show you how he did it here. Take a look. Well, these are the cylinders off the Benz-Mercedes. As you can see, there's no cylinder head. It's all one piece. You see, to get to the combustion chamber, you've got to go up through the bottom. It's a bit like going to the proctologist to get dental work done, you know. You can't do anything from the top. You got to go in through the bottom. And what this had these steel water jackets around here. See, and then the coolant would flow around here and cool the cylinders. Well, as you can see, after 100 years, they're all rusted. They got holes in them. They probably didn't seal that well in the first place. So we took on the challenge of making new ones, and the guys have just done a terrific job. Jimmy is our metal man, and let me show you what he's done. This is pretty amazing. Come on. Hey Jimmy, how you doing? This is Jimmy, our metal guy. He's just done an incredible job. As you can see, he's made these water jackets out of brass, and it's really amazing. So tell us what's involved here.
Basically, what we're doing, Jay, is we're stripping off the old sheet metal, which was made out of steel, which rotted and went really bad.
Right.
It wasn't intended to last that long, and we're replicating the whole thing out of brass sheet now.
Right.
And we're silver brazing it onto the original cylinder. So here we've got a naked one that we're prepping.
Right.
And grinding it clean, and then we're making the pieces from scratch again and templating everything, which that's what this is here.
Right.
And then we'll take that, transfer it all to brass, and then braze it back on the cylinder after the cylinder is cleaned.
Now this is the original metal on this one, correct?
That's original steel.
That's the original steel, and it's cleaned up, but you can see there's some rust holes and
lots of repairs.
And when we get this together, we're going to use our Evans coolant in it. That's that non-water-based coolant, so this will never rust again. And the way these work is these are right together, and then there's an O-ring that fits here. Oh, there you go.
There you go.
There you go. O-ring goes in between like that, and that seals it, and then a clamp goes around here. I'm glad this is not a V12, or it'd be another 50 years to go to get this thing done. But yeah, because when these were built, they weren't expected to last that long, I imagine.
No, not at all. Not out of steel.
Not out of steel. So cool. So anyway, hopefully this will last more than another 100 years.
Oh yeah.
And but as you can see, Jimmy does beautiful work. And once this is all really cleaned up, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it shows you how much hand labor was involved back in the day, and today too. Yeah, so.
And we're replicating everything. We're having to make our own dies.
Right.
And everything to make all the markings, the rolls, and even these are hand machined here.
Yeah.
Our guy, our Bernard here, machined all new fittings for us.
There we go.
So all the
See, these fit right here. Yeah.
And then even the end fittings that go to the radiator. Yeah. So we're doing everything from scratch.
Oh yeah. Oh, this is going to be a great engine when it's done. This thing is going to be just wow. When you open that hood, it's going to look like, pretty cool.
Maybe we want to put the hood back.
Huh? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe leave the hood off. Sure. Okay. These things were built when technology was expensive and labor was cheap. Now labor's expensive and technology is cheap. But
there we go.
But we're getting there. But like I said before, I'm glad it's not a 12-cylinder. But that gives you an update. We have two done now, and now you have the base plate here, which we didn't have done before. So now this one is completely finished. Just a matter of hooking up.
Right. These are completed, pressure checked, and now we're on our second one. And we're done with all of our tooling too.
Right.
So that's why they're going to move along a little quicker now. The next one took me probably half to a third amount of time to make because I didn't have to make the tooling. So now that we're moving right along, everything's pre-made.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of getting each one finished. The hardest part really is the preparation of them, because cutting the sheet metal off the original cylinders, we got to be careful not to cut into the original cast iron.
Right.
We've got to save all these threaded areas in the valve. So, you just not something you can just bust into.
You're not going to do this during a pit stop, okay? Just forget that.
It's going to take a little while.
All right. As you know, every car show should have a guy just throwing sparks for no reason. They just seem to do it in every show. That's what Jimmy's doing now. Yeah,
it looks good, Jay. It looks like I'm working.
Yeah, it does look like you're working.
Okay.
Let's move on. Actually, he is working. He's doing a great job on these. It takes about a month to make each one. And here he is, this one, we're up to 4. Thank God this is not a V12. So it's a 6-cylinder, so we got 2 more to go. We're getting there. This car had virtually no brakes. It just had mechanical brakes on the rears only. So what we did was we took a axle from a 29 Lincoln, which had 4-wheel brakes, and modified it to fit here. We put disc brakes in the middle and then put these drums on here. It's just to give the illusion of drum brakes back in the period. I've got the original axle. You can go back in any time to the way it was. But if you really want to drive this and use it for its intended purpose, you've got to have these kind of brakes on it. This is the same exact modification we did to the Botafogo, that other 22-liter Fiat from 1914. All right, let's get back to the engine. Agitude twin Zenith carburetors here. Those are not quite of the period. I think those are aero carbs, if I'm not mistaken. We put a modern fan on it. The way the oil pump is driven is really odd. This is something I always check when they take it out because it's the most dangerous looking part of this car. See, the oil pump is driven by this chain down here which hangs rather low. So I'm always careful when I go over speed bumps because then you just break the oil pump and that would seize the whole motor. It's very torquey. It still moves it. It'll do an honest 100 miles an hour. Anything over that, you start to go, hey, yeah. Gets a little But to go 113 and lap Brooklands in this thing, it's pretty crazy. These are the copper exhaust pipes, which are I just made from some old sewer pipe tubing or something. I mean, it's nothing exotic. I suppose I could go with a modern alternator on here, but this looks more period correct. That's a generator from back in the day. Probably puts out a tenth of what a modern alternator does, but you know, you're not running lights and things on this, so it's not really necessary. Now, this whole engine is covered by the ugliest hood I've ever seen. So I just like to run it open. This way, when you're in the vehicle, you can see the valves moving up and down and all that kind of stuff. Right here, the way these work is, when you open it, oil drips down, oil drips into this cup, which lubricates the bearings here, and then oil drips down on here. So after a while, when you drive this thing with goggles on, you look like a raccoon because your face is all black, and you take it off and you get, you know, so you all see those early photos of the race drivers, you know, with their face just completely filthy, and then you take it off and it's all clean under the goggles. That's because you've got an open oiling system that just throws oil pretty much everywhere. These are all water pipes here. It's a fascinating piece of kit, it really is, especially with this exhaust system, which is just made from, it looks like sewer pipe is pretty much what it is. It's chain drive, as you can see. It's still using the Mercedes-Benz transmission from the period. We adapted a modern clutch. The spring on this thing was unbelievable. It was a cone clutch. It wasn't very effective. This is the original clutch that came with it. It's what they call a cone type clutch. And this thing here is the spring. So it took a little bit of foot pressure to work that. But it slipped and it wasn't very dependable. It's a historic piece, but it's 100 years old. It's just not, it just wasn't viable anymore. So we called the folks at McLeod, and we've adapted a modern clutch to get this thing running properly. Now, always going to be people that say, no, it's not original anymore. You know, it was a race car, and race cars were constantly improved back in their day, and if they could have done this back in the day, sure they would have. But now it'll be dependable and safe, and as you can see, Bernard made that whole, and you made the pedal assembly too. Well, the reason Bernard replaced that clutch was for the original engine, which was probably 70 horse. Yes, if that much.
Yeah.
And now it's got this big 250 horsepower aero-engine in it, so that's one reason why it was replaced. And what do you tell me we have here, the two hydraulics?
Well, we got two hydraulic cylinders in here now on a new pedal linkage. One is for the brakes, of course, on the front, right. And then the other one is hydraulic cylinder for the clutch.
Yeah, so the rear brakes are operated by the hand
cable.
Yeah. So, but he'll do 70% of your stopping with that. But as you see, this McLeod clutch looks pretty cool.
It's a twin plate clutch.
Yeah.
So it'll handle the torque that the motor puts out.
Yeah, it steers and drives very nicely because probably because of these thin tires. As you see, you have twin chains on the rear. You have these dampers here. These are not, people sometimes think they're shock absorbers. They're not. The idea is you have a spring, and springs bounce because where every reaction is a reaction. And what happens with dampers was that you hit a bump, the spring would compress, and then you can tighten these, and then it comes up slowly so you don't go pogoing down the road. This is your transmission here. It's a 4-speed box. This is your handbrake. This just stops the rear wheels. The foot brake stops the front wheels. So when you're going down the road, you kind of want to do them both in conjunction to kind of retard progress, as we say. It's pretty much as it was in 1921. It's a rather ungainly looking thing, especially with the hood on it. With the hood off, it really looks magnificent when you see all that calliope of mechanical parts going up and down. These are not high revving engines, so they don't tend to wear out. Although I guess they would have been high revving engines back in the day. 1800 RPM was, wow, something moving 1800 a minute. That's pretty quick, but of course nowadays it's nothing. Yeah, I'm surprised. I mean, Jimmy did a wonderful job here with these water jackets. They don't leak. I mean, maybe a little bit, but certainly not enough that you would notice. What I do is I shut off these oilers up here, and I use some assembly lube, and I put it on each piece because it just just throwing oil everywhere you're going down the road. So the assembly lube will last 50 miles or so, maybe 100 miles, and then you just put some more on, and it just sort of cleans it up a little bit. obviously this flywheel was made back in the, I think, 30s or early 40s, because being an aircraft engine did not have a flywheel like that started with teeth in it. You could start with an electric starter because it was, you started by spinning the prop. But that was adapted, and that was quite expensive. I think it was like $3,500 to do back in the day, which was a tremendous amount of money. This is all homemade stuff here, this intake manifold. It's interesting that they went to a 1908 Mercedes chassis, because by the teens and the 20s, they kind of knew some of the tensile strength of metal. They knew what it could take. So early cars just used the biggest, heaviest chassis they could. And this 1908 Mercedes is a good example of that. So they bolted this in here, and it works quite well, actually. It works fine. It's called a Benz-Mercedes because it's a Mercedes that uses a Benz engine. Mercedes-Benz did not incorporate until 1924. When Daimler sold cars in France, the French were not huge fans of the Germans, and there was a French salesman named Emil Jelnik. And Jelnik said, I'll buy 36 of your cars, your Daimlers, your Benz cars, but I want to name them after my daughter. His daughter's name was Mercedes, because I think French people like that. It doesn't sound very German. And he was very successful. He was so successful in the fact that in France they were all sold under the name Mercedes. He was a great salesman. And then when the company incorporated in 24, they became Mercedes-Benz because the name was just known throughout the land for that reason. And Peter Helk is the one, he was an artist, so he designed this badge for the front. This radiator, I believe, is off a 1919 Locomobile. It was a bit of a bits of even back in the day, but the cool thing is it was built back in the day. It was called Rabbit the First. Scarsbrook named it after his wife. Why he called her Rabbit, you can use your own imagination and try to figure that one out yourself. Don't take that much thought, really. But that's what he did. And it was a street car for a while, and it just knocked around. I know it was in the parade in 1940 in New York City. It was in the Easter parade. And then pictures have shown up over the years. It's not like, now you can go to the internet and find out all this kind of stuff. But back in the day, there was just no repository for all that kind of material. People had it in drawers and stuff like that. So I've had this car about 10 years. And when I got it, it ran. I got it from David North, a very nice collector out of Maryland. He was another one of those, him and his dad, Judge North, liked to save classic cars. In fact, his dad still has a Duesenberg. His grandfather bought his father back in 1932, which is kind of interesting. It was sort of a romantic story about the engine. It came out of a crashed German World War I plane. It was thought to be very valuable at the time. And the engine was wrapped up in, well, I don't know if they had plastic, but certainly some sort of leather, whatever it was. And the engine was buried in the backyard, and the owner thinking he would dig it up after the war and use it in something. But by the time the war ended, these kind of engines were all over the place. They were just war surplus. They weren't that cheap. But he dug it out and built this. So that's kind of interesting. Come on, let's take a look at the inside of the car and show you what we have here. Actually, the dashboard is nothing spectacular, pretty plain Jane, just meant to be utilitarian. This was a race car. You have your temperature gauge here, oil pressure, fuel. This one is fuel pressure, ammeters, tachometer. And this is your magnetos, left one, right one, both. That's self-explanatory. That's fan, that's your tail light, that's your fuel pump. We have an electric fuel pump in it. This is your starter button right here. Over here, I think these are the turn signals, but they're not quite hooked up. This is your horn, and this is your choke. And here you have your timing and your idle. This is for gas, controls the idle. And your timing, advance, and retard. And that's pretty simple. This is your oiler. When you turn on the overhead oil feed that drips onto the various places where the oil is supposed to go, you see it oil dripping here, and it lets you know how many drops per minute, but that gets so messy. It just goes all over the place. This is a light we put on just to tell you that the generator is working and not working. When the light goes out, the generator's charging. If you're traveling, you're on the continent, well, you have your trunk back here. You can put various things, the batteries in there, and I've got tools and a few other things. Something we made here at the shop, using our 3D printer, we made a plastic tool so we can change the wheels when we have to. That's kind of cool. Gas tank, of course, is underneath. Tail light is there. Your chains on each side. You need to lube those chains as well. Notice you have chain guards right here. If you didn't, when you put your hand outside, you don't want to do that. That's going to hurt. And of course, the massive muffler, which actually keeps it fairly quiet, at least quiet enough that you can drive it in traffic. Not that people would notice you in traffic. As you can see, we really haven't cleaned this up. We took it for a long drive the other day, went to a car meet with it, and just threw oil all over the place. But that's how it looks, sort of in anger when you're driving it. That's sort of what it looks like. I mean, you can polish it all up and then go 2 miles and oil's all over the place. So it doesn't do you a lot of good. But we can actually stop it now with those brakes, so that's very nice. And we have the modern starter, which weighs about 10 pounds less than the one that was on there, and it spins it really fast. So it starts relatively quickly. I think she's about ready to go for a ride. Now what I do now before we go for a ride is I have some assembly lube here. And what we do is you try to hit, so you make your engine last a long time. This is Lucas assembly lube. We like using this stuff. It's basically a thick grease. It doesn't get flung off. It'll stay on for a long time. And I try to put a drop of it on each area. You see, this is a push rod here. As push rod goes up and down, that ball moves back and forward. So this will sort of spread the grease around. Then I put a little in between here, in between each of the rocker arms. Go to this next one. Now, as you're driving, you make some assembly lube may waft back, and you get the delicious taste of assembly lube. If it was me, I would maybe put some sort of minty taste in it. So when you're driving, oh, assembly lube, that's so bad. If you take it straight, it's terrible. Okay, let's put it on the side here. This is what you do when you want to take out an old car. You just don't get in and start it up. Like an airplane, you kind of do a pre-flight and make sure everything seems okay. If there's oil all over the place, that's actually a good sign, because that means there's oil getting all over the place. And that's what you want. Okay. And remember, this is 4 valves per cylinder, so we need to go and do the other side as well. You know, the one great thing about modern lubricants are they're so much better than what was available back in the day. These kind of things, you just ran a straight 50 weight oil. No detergents, no nothing, so you got a lot of sludge, a lot of buildup. Modern lubricants are so good. Just got to be careful you don't go with too thin an oil, because these old oil pumps, a really thin oil will get past them and you lose pressure. A little bit of zinc in there doesn't hurt either. Okay. Seal that up, put that back in the car, and I think we're about ready to go for a ride. every circuit. Boy, you gotta have steel something or other to do that. You know, I'm tempted to put the hood on it, but it's just so much fun watching those valves go up and down. Actually, it shifts quite nicely, especially with this modern McLaren clutch in there. I'm barely turning 600 RPM. Water temperature about 85 centigrade, which is not bad, considering it's 85 degrees Fahrenheit out here today. Can you hear those chains rattling? It's like Marley's ghost, just clanging. Always want to keep your hands inside this thing in case one of those chains breaks, it'll whip around and cut your arm off. This engine is so under stress in this application that it's barely working at all. I'm turning 700 RPM. We're doing maybe, I don't know, 60 miles an hour, something like that. You always feel like you're taxiing in a plane all the time. Get a little taste of that assembly lube. Modern cars are fun, but you gotta go like 150 miles an hour. This thing at 70 will just scare the hell out of you. The nice thing about slow revving engines like this is they last a long time because they barely wear out. And that Pierce hour I've got is an 826 cubic inch 6. And that thing's rarely over 700 RPM. In fact, the engine's really never been apart. This is such an exciting car to drive. It's so much fun visually. It's fascinating to look at the noise, the change, the valve gear, the exhaust. I can't imagine what this must have been like in 1921. If anybody in England has any period pictures of this thing back in the day, I'd love to see them. Drop us a note. It's really just a low-flying aircraft. That's what it is. Love this big steering wheel. It's really not heavy to steer at all. Turns rather nicely, especially with these skinny tires on it. Still runs nice and cool. I'm now at 75 degrees centigrade, which is not bad. We were running about 70 miles an hour. That's pretty good. You can idle this thing right down to 200 RPM. That's about 200 RPM right there.
Mm-hmm.